Okay, so this is 9:30 a.m. for you. Okay.
Yes. Yep. And
Mhm.
10:30 p.m. to you.
10, not bad
10 o'clock.
actually.
Oh yeah,
10.
half hour, right? Yeah, yeah.
Mm. So let's keep it very casual, Mike.
Sure.
More like learning from you, your perspective. Though I sent questions, we will
Yeah,
more or less cover those questions, but we will keep it very casual. I'll
sure.
extract from recording all that, right? So starting with our first thing, right? I mean, uh, you've been like in the computer industry for a long time. I mean, nobody. I didn't touch my first computer until I joined my engineering. But you were
Yeah.
there like in the initial days. How was it like? What's your perspective when you look back? How does it feel? All that, Mike. I mean, can you share?
It's very funny. So when I was at Microsoft in the 90s, I did recruiting, hiring new people for us. And I went back to my alma mater, the school I went to undergraduate at, where I graduated in 1980. So this was maybe 16, 18 years after I'd graduated. So the kids that the folks I were interviewing were just children or not even born when I graduated. And one of them said to me, "Wow, you were in computer science in 1980. You were there at the very, very beginning." And I said, that's funny. That's what we used to tell people who were there in 1960, because that's when it really started,
Uh,
And so,
right,
so
right,
it's,
true.
so I mean, but I did feel like I was very, very fortunate. I went to my family's Catholic, and I went to a Catholic high school in Chicago, which is where I grew up. And for whatever reason, I mean, this was remarkably unusual. This was in the mid 70s. So I was in high school in 73, 74, 75. The math teacher there, Ken Janowick, who really got me started on this, had arranged to buy a computer. We had a digital
Mhm.
PDP-8, which was a small mini computer from Digital, which Digital was really a big company at that time. I mean, they were really,
True.
it was sort of DEC and IBM and Data General. Those were sort of the big players in the computer industry. And Digital had this specialization in kind of mini computers. And so he taught a class in BASIC, and then he got one of the other math teachers to teach a class in Fortran. So there was sort of a two-class curriculum, and I took both those classes and absolutely loved it. And so he said to me, "Hey, what do you want to start a computer club?" And we had all these clubs, and so I said, "Sure." So I was the first person who started the computer club there. We had probably 6 or 8 folks that were really interested in that, and so that's when I really got the computer bug. Was in sort of 74, 75. And so when I went to college, I was pretty sure that I wanted to major in computer science. And so I picked school based on it. And Northwestern, where I went, which is nearby my high school, it was in Chicago. They had a lab that was a whole collection of these PDP-8s. I remember touring it and going, "I want to go here because that is exactly what I want to do." And I showed
Right.
up at that lab. So before I was admitted to school, but I hadn't even started. School started in this would have been September of 76. And so that June, I just showed up at the lab one morning and said, "Hey, I'm a new student. I'm going to start in the fall. I'd love to just hang around the lab this summer, just hang out
Mm.
and learn a little bit." And they're like, "Well, sure, you could do that." And so they set me up and I started tinkering around. And within 3 weeks, I had a job because they had some stuff that they needed to get done. And they saw that I knew what I was doing. And I worked in that lab all through college. And I learned so much in that lab, and so that was really my introduction and they had the next step up from the PDP-8. They had PDP-11s, which were kind of the state of the art at that time. And eventually, they got VAXs, which were the sort of bigger machines. And these were sort of the super minis of the 70s and early 80s. And so one summer during my college years, I got an internship at Digital Equipment. So I actually went to work for DEC in Boston for the summer, just doing some, technical programming stuff, which I absolutely loved. And it was just a
Right.
fantastic, experience. And so that's kind of got me started. And I got into AT&T afterwards. And that's when I really learned C and Unix. I had been working on these digital systems that we were programming in. I don't even remember. I think we were programming them in Fortran, probably. Pascal.
Mm.
Some in school was Pascal as well. But it was really when I went to AT&T that I learned C and Unix, and this was in sort of the early '80s. And it went on from there. So yeah. So in a sense, I was there in really kind of a golden age of computing, but it was by no means the beginning. I mean, really it had started in the even the 40s and 50s, and really had taken off in the 60s. And by the time I was there, I don't know, there were probably 125 undergraduates in computer science, so it wasn't like it was a tiny department, right? I mean, it was a well-established discipline by then.
But was it norm like even other like today? If you see, a lot of people go for computer education. Not today, even when I did my engineering. But when you took it up, was it normal for people to pick up, or only few people who were really passionate know about it?
Yeah, it was not a super popular major. I mean, it was not unknown, but the hot majors at the time I was in college were chemical engineering, because you were going to go into there were really good high paying industrial jobs in chemical engineering. So chemical engineering was very hot, and industrial engineering was also very hot, because it was seen as kind of a, automating processes and kind of a good lead into an MBA. And computer science was
maybe guaranteed job, maybe.
Exactly.
Maybe guaranteed job.
And at higher salaries, right? I mean, those were making more money than computer people were at that time. I mean, computer was seen as kind of a geeky math, kind of person, that would be in computer. So it was not seen as a mainstream thing. And I mean, interestingly, I mean, now so much of computers is associated with money, and a lot of money, and people being really well paid. That was not, I mean, my view is that I was going to have a solid middle class job. I mean, I was going to make a good salary, but I was not going to get rich. That was not my goal, and that was not the goal of anybody in computers that I knew at the time. I mean, everybody just was like, hey, we just like doing this, and we're going to get paid, and to some extent, I can't believe they pay me for doing this, because it's so much fun. So, yeah. True.
So those initial coding days, be it in AT&T or digital, who were the customers, and what were the kind of problems they were ready to pay for computer programmers?
Yeah. Great question. So the internship that I was doing at Digital was within a group called, I probably can't remember the name of it, but it was basically manufacturing. And they had some computers that were being used to automate manufacturing process. So they were monitoring, stuff going by, and scanning barcodes and stuff to be able to see, what was being going down the assembly line and so forth. And so we were programming, I was doing a demo. My job for that summer internship was build a demo of this particular feature of this manufacturing, device. So it was written, and I think I probably wrote it in, BASIC, actually, is probably what I wrote it in, because I didn't know C at that time, and I don't think C was mainstream. So, yeah, but so manufacturing was certainly part of what people were using. There wasn't really the concept of a personal computer at that time. Like, you wouldn't have your own. That really didn't happen until the mid 80s with the introduction of the Macintosh, and then the IBM PC. So the idea of having your own computer was not really a thing. Like, you would have, these devices were the size of kind of a window air conditioner. So they were sort of like this big, with the small ones. The big ones were big, but the small one was sort of that size. And then you would have RS-232 ports, which is a serial interface connected to video terminals. The VT100 was a big terminal at that time. So you'd have a little video terminal that looks about, kind of what an old Macintosh looks like in terms of just a keyboard and a display. But that's all it was keyboard and display, and then a serial interface going to the computer, and you interacted in totally command line, mode. There was no graphics, there was none of that back then. So it was all just kind of command line, and text-based forms. The first project that I was hired to work on in college, my first job really in computers, the first paying job in computers, was the lab. To make money to help support the lab, had a exam grading software. So for some of the larger classes at Northwestern, where you might have 800 or 1,000 students, they would have the students mark up the answer. They were all multiple choice tests, and they would mark them up on a MarkSense card. form, and then we had a reader that would read these forms, and then there was a master example, and then we would figure out, okay, was that answer right? Was that answer wrong? And so I had to make a bunch of improvement, and that code was written in Fortran, and I had to make a bunch of changes to that over the summer. And what I didn't know, and I mean, partly my fault, but partly my boss's fault, is that, when you make changes, you got to test it. There actually has to be testing involved here. Nobody told me that, and I didn't know. And so, I'm just making changes like crazy, and like it compiles and it seems to work. And so it's probably okay, right? And we get our first exam in September. It was a psychology class, and there were probably 400 or so forms that came in, and we're reading these forms in, and and then it's printing out the results, and the results are like, the results should be like 60% or 70%. Basically, what percent of the answers did you get right? Somewhere between 0 and 100%. We were getting like minus 340%, 1,265%. I'm like, what's going wrong here? And it was quite a crisis, because we were supposed to get the results back to this professor for this exam, because he had to give it back to the students, and he was there totally upset about this. Like, I can't believe you guys, are doing this. And it turned out that what I didn't know in Fortran is that the first letter of the variable name determines whether it's a floating point number or an integer number. And variables named between I and N with the first letter are integers, and variables named with other letters are floating point. And you can override that. You can declare a variable to say, even though it's called I want it a floating point. But I didn't do that, and I didn't even know. And so I had just happened to pick some variable names that were integer that really needed to be floating point, and that just caused the whole program to not work correctly. So fortunately, we were able to, once we figured it out, we were able to fix it. But it's when I really learned, like, you got to test that stuff, so.
Yeah. Sir, Mike, I started my engineering in 95, and we were still got to learn Fortran, Pascal, Basic, COBOL, all that.
Okay.
We also started with Fortran. Yeah.
I mean, Fortran was a workhorse language for a long time, right? I mean, that really goes back to the 60s, where it really was. And I mean, even today, I think there still is some scientific stuff that is done in Fortran, because that's what other engineers learn, and it's well oriented towards scientific programming. But so much has changed since then, with the whole idea of libraries and object oriented. And back then, maybe once in a while you would use some library that might be a statistics library or something. But now you look at most programs, and they're 70% open source. The library that does the date picker, and the library that does the graphing engine and stuff. All that's huge. That's a huge change.
So AT&T was like probably one of the 4 or 5 companies in the world that were pioneers in IT industry, right?
Yeah, and really,
how many
Bell
engineers like you were like?
Really,
Bell Labs, correct.
So Bell Labs is the research part. I was on more the industrial manufacturing part of AT&T. The company I worked for that was part of AT&T actually made teletype machines. So I don't know if you remember teletype machines, but these are little printers that print out messages, and you can send messages over the phone lines to them. They were used a lot for newspapers, that would get the transmissions of stories from around the world. And so I worked for Teletype, and I didn't ever work on the printing part, but I worked on a part where we were building terminals. And again, these were not computers. I mean, they had small chips inside them, but they really were to act as terminals for a larger computer, as just being display and input. And the project I got to work on, which was kind of interesting, was really the first windowing graphics display that AT&T did. Up until then, they had done these character mode, just sort of textual. But this was a project that had come out of Bell Labs. And the idea was that you would have multiple windows on the screen, and each of those windows could talk to a different program running on the computer. And the computer wasn't within the display, but it could talk over it. And so they were multiplexing the RS-232 line. Now remember, this was at a fast RS-232 line at that point was 19.2 kilobytes. So 19,000 characters per second, and you're multiplexing it over 5 or 6. So you might be getting only like 2,000 or 3,000 characters per second for your particular thing. I mean, just an order of magnitude or a couple of orders of magnitude less than what we would expect today from even this little device, right? But it worked, and you know, there were some programs that were used, and one of the projects we did was for an energy company in the south of the U.S., and they had a order entry system, and because of the way that the order entry system was done, they actually had their order clerks had two or three terminals on their desk, because they would have to use this one to talk about the customer system, and then this one to talk about scheduling the visit, and then this one to talk about the billing for it, and so forth. And so they would actually swivel around and go between these machines. And what we were able to do is say, no, we can put that in one machine. You'll have 3 windows. Each window will talk to the different programs. And that was like a big transformation for them. So that was kind of interesting. So I got to work on that. And I was there for about 5 years, and learned a ton. I mean, great place to work, you know, really great. And some colleagues that I still am in touch with today, you know, that I worked with back then, that, you know, they're not at AT&T anymore, because AT&T's gone through a lot of transformation since, you know, so yeah.
You still, I mean, it's very, it's amazing that you remember so minute details of those days. That tells how much you loved those days.
Oh, I loved it. I loved it. I mean, and it was great. And actually, one of the tensions for me personally was, and really this came from my college years, is that I got very interested in politics and in public policy while I was in college. And then I also was very interested in computers. And so when I came out, I was trying to decide, you know, do I really want to work more in politics, you know, and have computers as kind of a hobby, or do I want to work in computers and have politics as kind of a hobby? And I chose the latter. But after 5 years at AT&T, so this was 1985, I'd been involved as a volunteer with an organization, political organization, and they approached me and said, hey, we're looking for a state director. We're looking for somebody who could run the operation here in the state. And you seem to be interested in this. You know, you've been a volunteer for a while. Would you be interested in the job? And it just so happened that I was at that point where I was getting ready to leave AT&T anyway. I kind of gotten tired of, you know, some of the politics there and stuff. And it was a big company. And I mean, there was a lot of really good about it, but I was kind of done. I was ready to move on to something else. I'd been there 5 years. And I decided, you know, I'm going to give this a try. So for 3 years, I went and I was the Illinois state political director for this political organization that at the time, one of the big issues here in the US at least, and I think really globally, was the increasing risk of nuclear war and nuclear weapons. And so this was a group called the Nuclear Freeze. And their idea was, let's put a freeze on new nuclear weapons. Let's not build any more. An agreement between at that time, it was the Soviet Union and the United States to not build any more nuclear weapons. And we were promoting this idea of a freeze, and we had some real traction around it. So I was the director in Illinois for that, working on organizing people, speaking, raising money, a whole different set of skills, you know, than what I had worked on in computers. And I really enjoyed that and learned a lot from that. But again, after about 3 years, I was kind of ready to get back into computers again. And so that's when I went back to work in computers. But I still think that job, you know, those 3 years served me really, really well, because it taught me a lot of the communication and speaking skills and persuasion skills that I still use today. So that was a really great experience.
Probably if you continued, you could have gone to Congress one day.
Who knows?
I mean, you never know.
Who knows? Yeah. Exactly right.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So this was between AT&T and Microsoft then.
And then I worked one other place before Microsoft, which was a small startup in Chicago. And then my wife and I decided, we had just gotten married. We'd been married for maybe 2 years, and she really did not like Chicago. She had not grown up there, and she really wanted to go to the West. She wanted to go out to the Western U.S., where it's much more, you know, a lot more nature and beauty and stuff. And so, so I decided, okay, well, I'm going to look for a job out there. And I had got in touch with Microsoft, and so they hired me. So I started at Microsoft in June of 1993, and my son at that time was 1 year old. We just moved out here with him, and we've been out here ever since. So that's been going on 30 years now. And my son is going to be 29 next month. So yeah. Wow. So it's and that was a really interesting experience, because at the time I joined Microsoft, it was a known company. I mean, everyone knew who it was, but it wasn't a behemoth. It was not a,
Correct.
I mean, it
Yeah.
was, I think there were maybe 10,000 employees when I joined. Windows 3.1 had just come out maybe a year or two before. And Windows 3.1 was really the kind of the breakthrough product, for Windows, because Windows earlier than that was just kind of buggy, but 3.1 really made it work. And Office was a very successful suite of products, but really more individual. So there was a Word team, there was an Excel team, there was a PowerPoint team, and one of the marketing guys had gotten the idea of, hey, we need to bundle this together and sell it as a unit, because the competitors that we had were in those verticals, and they were actually pretty good. Like VisiCalc and Lotus were in, Lotus 123 was in the spreadsheet space.
I know.
A strong competitor to Excel. WordPerfect was a strong competitor to Word, but none of them, they were all just, verticals. And what Office could offer is the whole suite, right? They could say, no, you don't have to. And these will all work better together and everything. And at the time, 93, when I joined, that was really mostly just a marketing thing. There really was no integration technically between the products. They basically just took the products and put them in one box and sold them. But I was part of the team that they were building. I was hired onto the team that said, hey, if we want to make these work together, we need to do some common code. We need to have some features that are the same code running in Word and Excel and PowerPoint and everything else. And so I was on Office Shared Features, which the idea at that time was, let's go build some shared features that we can integrate into each of the products, and then they'll work the same way in the products because it's the same code actually running. The team was small. It was only maybe 20 people when I joined.
For the entire suite? For
the entire Office shared team. So there were probably 80 people on the Word team at that time, and 90 people on the Excel team, and so the product teams were way bigger. And then we had this tiny little Office shared team, and of course the product teams, were somewhat skeptical of us, like, who are you coming telling us what to do, right? And stuff. And so there was definitely some transition there. But over time, and I worked on Office from 93 until 2007. So really for almost 14 years. It really shifted enormously during that time, to where by the time I left Office in 2007, there was a very large Office shared team, and then small little Word team, Excel team. And the sort of default take was, if we're going to do a feature, let's do it as an Office shared feature, and make it work in all the apps, and only things that are very specific to Excel should be done by the Excel team, things that are specifically about particular kinds of formulas, or, so even graphing. The idea was, well, I don't want to just be able to do graphs in Excel. I should be able to do those in PowerPoint and in Word as well. And so,
So probably you would have rewritten code multiple times, like in 93, written in C, I don't know which language, then moved on to C# at a later date. I think Office would have been rewritten, and you have been there like in the entire Office, which it took shape, Mike. I mean, what was the journey like? You see what I'm saying? Like, the world did not know Office. We came to know with Windows 95. That was the breakthrough in India, at least.
Office 95 was the real big breakthrough product. Yeah. And, it was a matter of thinking about what the features are that could be used across the applications. So like and some of those were misses, frankly. Like the whole, I don't know if you remember, but it was really in Office 97 that this introduced, was the idea of toolbars. And toolbars were this very reconfigurable, customizable user interface. Every menu was really just a toolbar, and every toolbar was really just a menu. And so you could totally customize everything. And it was kind of the programmer's dream that people really want to customize their software. And the reality is, people really don't. People just want to use the software to get stuff done. So there was an enormous amount of engineering work that went into building those toolbars and all the customization features and everything else, and making it work in different places, and then integrating it into Word and Excel and PowerPoint and everything. And in my view, a lot of that was not all that useful. The one positive thing that came out of it is that it really did cause a lot more alignment and rationalization across the menu structure, so that you had the file menu in Word and the file menu in Excel and the file menu in PowerPoint looked pretty much the same because it was the same code. And that just does help people. It makes it easier for people to use it, because if you know how to do it in Word, you probably already know how to do it in PowerPoint. And so there was that. One of the more successful features actually that was done as a shared feature was tables. And tables were initially done for Word, and the idea was to have table formatting where you could have, banded rows and you could sort and all that kind of stuff. But the way it was done was in a common way, so it applied to Excel and PowerPoint as well. And so today you can copy a table from Word, paste it into PowerPoint, and it pretty much works because, again, it's the same underlying table code. So that was a pretty successful one. And then, the autocorrect stuff, so the spell checking and so forth, that was done as a common feature as well. And that actually, I think, was originally done by Word, and then they took the code out of Word and made it a common feature that they exposed across the. And technically, what we were doing under the covers is, we were, there was winword.exe, which was the executable for Word, and excel.exe, which was the executable for Excel. And we were building something called MSO.dll, which was Microsoft Office.dll. So we were building a DLL that we shipped and that the applications depended on and used for these features. And so there was a common interface that the applications used and everything else. So that's how it worked technically, is we shipped into a DLL that the applications used and that they were able to leverage.
Last question on this, and then we'll move.
Yeah.
Because today you have the feedback loop is built in, because the whole cloud and subscription based offerings is easy. But back in those days, when you designed those menus, toolbars, we did not have this feedback loop. You had to imagine what customer would want and design. So how are you getting the feedback from customers?
Yeah, one of my friends, my colleagues at the time, described it as, it's like ordering pizza for 180 million people. It's like, what do you put on it, right? Everybody wants something different, right? And so,
true.
And so they at that time, and Microsoft really, I think. Probably Apple really was one of the innovators in this, but Microsoft certainly had done a lot on it, which was a whole area called user research. And user research was a team, and some of them had technical backgrounds, but a lot of them had more social psychology, backgrounds, where they understood how people think about things and how people approach things. And they would literally, put out an ad in the paper saying, hey, we want people to come in and do some testing. We'll give you $25, or we'll give you a gift certificate for a restaurant or something if you come in. And so they would bring in average people just happened to see this ad in the paper, had nothing to do with Microsoft. And they would put them in front of prototypes, and they would watch them work, and they would see where did they get stopped. Sometimes they would have exercises for them, like, hey, you need to do this. You need to create a table that describes, these things, and then just watch how people did it and see what things do they stumble on, what things do they not, and they would record these things. They literally had like a lab that people would be in, and so you could be behind the glass in the lab watching people, and the developers would be there sometimes, like, oh my God, it's so hard for them. Like, why don't they just, But it's
right.
It was also very relevant, kind of revealing to the developers to see, hey, this is how average people use your software, and what you think is really obvious is not obvious to people. So that was one way they got it, was through user research. And then early on, I think this was probably around Office 2000, that they introduced the idea of SQM. And SQM was SQM, and it stood for Service Quality Metrics. And what it did was it collected a bunch of data down on the machine. So we weren't internet connected at that point. The apps were not, going over the internet at all, but it would collect this data in a local file. And then I think there was some mechanism where you could upload it. Maybe when I don't remember how the data got back, but there was a mechanism to get the data off of the local machine. And the way this was exposed to people is when you installed the software, it would say, do you want to help improve Microsoft software? And if you said yes, it would metrics. And the metrics were literally like what buttons are you clicking, what menu items, and so forth. It wouldn't be anything private like what are you actually typing, because we didn't want to get people's personal data, but fairly detailed metrics on what stuff are people doing within the app. And that was very informative to the team, because what they learned is that, and that really helped inform what the buttons are that were on the ribbon that were introduced, I think, with Office 2003, because they knew what commands people actually used. They could look at the metrics and say, these are the 10 commands people use all the time. Those should be on the home ribbon, right? These other commands don't get used almost at all, so let's push them down somewhere else. And they're still there, but they're not, So Squim was a big thing in collecting that data. And then, later on, we started getting into more, as you say, subscription, where the data is just flowing all the time.
Correct. So great journey at Microsoft, and what made you to just come out of it? Because you could have, just as an outsider, you could have grown in your career and become something today. But
Yeah.
I'm sure something drove you to start.
Yeah, I had been there for, as of 2010, I'd been there about, so what would that be, like, 10, 17 years, 16 years, something like that. And, I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot there. And I really liked the people I worked with, learned a ton from the people I worked with there. But it had been a long time, and I had just turned 50. And so I sort of said to myself, I'm probably going to do this for another 10, maybe 15 years, and then I'm going to hopefully retire. Do I want to do that at Microsoft, or do I want to do that somewhere else? Because, 50 is kind of a turning point where you probably can still get a job somewhere else. But, people, you're starting to think you're kind of old, you're kind of over the, and so I thought, I really want to get myself positioned where I don't have to worry where I'm looking for a job when I'm 55 or 58 years old, when people are like, you're just an old guy, and stuff. So that's when I decided, I think I'm going to go start my own thing. And I wasn't even sure what we were going to do. I knew it was going to be something in tech. And I also had gotten a little tired of the just all the management overhead of being in a big company. There's just a lot of, having to do performance reviews of people all the time, and, managing people and managing your manager, and then, all this bureaucracy and everything. And, Microsoft wasn't terrible that way, but it was still a big company. It was probably 90,000 employees by that point. And so, it was a big company and had a lot of big company things. And I was kind of like, I just want to go back and do tech again. And I actually thought, I'm just going to become a developer. I'm just going to go and write code. And what I found was there's a lot of people out there writing code, and as a result, the price for actually writing code is not very high. And so that's probably not something that I'm going to be competitive in. And so I stumbled around for a little bit, trying to figure out, okay, could I, Azure had just come out at that point. AWS had been out for a while, but Azure had just come out. And so I kind of felt like, well, everybody's new on Azure. Nobody really knows anything about Azure because it's new. So I can become kind of an expert in Azure and kind of coach on that. And so I explored that a little bit, but I found that also was a pretty crowded field. There were a lot of people trying to do that. And so, and I'm like, well, what's my advantage there? And then I just sort of stumbled into, by coincidence, this idea of doing technology due diligence. I was talking to somebody, and they're like, well, we really need somebody to look at the technical quality of what we're buying. And I'm like, well, I think I could do that. And so I started down that path, and here we are 10 years later. That's all we do.
So are there so many people looking for that kind of service normally, Mike, where technical due diligence to be done?
It's interesting. I think it's grown a lot in the last, because initially we had one big client, and that was our only work. And fairly early on, after 2-3 years, I realized, we have to broaden this out, because, that's a real risk. Like if they decided to go in a different direction or whatever, that's a risk to us. So we started broadening out, and we hired a business development person, somebody who would focus on that, because I had been trying to do it, but I'm an engineer. I don't know how to do business development, and so so I hired somebody to do that, and he really helped us quite a bit broaden out into other areas, partly by looking at who else needs this. And one of the things he identified that I had not thought of, because I had thought, well, we'll just go work for other tech companies. Tech companies are buying tech companies, and so let's just go work for them. And we had not had much success there. We talked to somebody at Google, we talked to somebody at Amazon, we talked to somebody at Adobe, and none of that ever really went anywhere. And he identified, no, actually, the opportunity here is private equity. Because they're investing all the time and they know that they don't understand enough about the technology, that they need externals. Whereas part of the problem with the other tech companies is they felt like, why would we hire somebody to do that? We could do that ourselves, right? So that was, and then the other niche was non-tech buying tech. So it's companies that are not technical companies by their nature, but they're buying tech companies because they need that feature for their products or whatever. And again, they fit that model of, we don't really know how to assess this. We know we want to assess the technical quality. So I think that was one transformation, was really sort of broadening out our understanding of the market and reaching out to those other companies. And then it becomes a fly, once you get introduced. So some of the private equity people that we work with move to other private equity companies in their own career, and then they bring us along because they're like, well, I worked with these guys before and they're really good. So then we get introduced to this new private equity company, and then that sort of that creates. So we now have a fair number, I would say, maybe 15 or 20 private equity companies that we've done work for. And then the other thing that I think is happening is that as tech is becoming more and more important, people are realizing that technical diligence is a missing piece of the acquisition process. I mean, they always knew they had to do financial diligence. They always knew they had to do legal diligence. But technical diligence, and we've seen companies who are like, they have 1,500 customers. They had, $20 million a year in revenue. Of course, they're fine technically. And we're like, not necessarily. And we do find out stuff all the time that is potentially problematic, even with companies that are successful on the outside, but on the inside, it's a house of cards, So I think there's more.
But do you even
awareness.
Sorry. Do you have competitors, Mike? Because for me, you are the first company who is doing this. I have not come across someone who does.
Yeah. No, there are other competitors. There are other companies out there that are doing this. One that's here in Seattle that we sometimes encounter is called Cross Lake. There's one that's called Waypoint that is also here in Seattle. And then the bigger competitors are like, there's a company out of the UK called Intellius, and they do more IT due diligence. So they're looking at the internal systems, the networking, how do they manage, their stuff, but they've expanded into technical as well. And then the other big competitors are the big consulting firms. So, Deloitte,
the big four.
and Young,
correct,
because they're already involved in the deal from an accounting point of view or from a marketing diligence point of view. So it's like, oh yeah, we'll do the tech too, and so that's another competitor, is those big firms,
But they might reach to you in case if they lack in some area.
Yeah, I mean, and I think we show up as pretty technically savvy and with good recommendations. So yeah, so it's we've grown quite a bit. I mean, I think we've probably grown 50% over the last 2.5 years in terms of revenue and stuff. So yeah, it's been and the market is very hot right now. So
okay,
yeah.
My next question, I mix few things and then put across the question and see how. So you touched upon the corporate bureaucracy, the multi-layers and stuff. And I worked for HP. Digital,
okay, so
which HP acquired.
Yeah.
I know. And I worked for Dell for a long time, 10 to 12 years.
Okay.
And I worked for, if you know, Ogilvy and Mather, the advertisement company. I worked for the parent company to establish their dynamics practice. Another big behemoth. So I know what you're saying. In fact, in the IT space, because I come from captive, I did a lot of IT work. The actual work is only 20-30%, Mike. A lot of time is spent educating your next layer, status reporting, decision-taking process takes longer, but the actual work is only 20-30%.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And you take that one angle. Second is the work habits are changing across the globe. Connectivity is very good now. We can connect from anywhere. and we need not, I mean, people who are really savvy, they want to move from one problem to the other, keep on solving, right? And like you said, there is a due diligence, system analysis, architecture. You put any problem statement, and the expertise can come from anywhere. If you put all these three together, and if you create a digital platform where you put a need and you match the need and you deliver what is asked by customer, either they need a professional who does it or they need it to be getting done. Let the platform take care of it, right? This, in my opinion, probably could be one of the ways of future of work. I want to hear from you what you think is future of work, what you think what I just said, which is what AiDOOS is planning to do, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think so the challenge today is that, and so much of the software is artisanal in the sense that it is custom grown, for a specific set of needs. And so I think there's always been the dream that we could just sort of put these components together and then we would have an app that does what we need. And it's not like there has been no progress along that route, right? I mean, Salesforce and Force.com as a platform, in my political life, which I'm still involved in politics now, in more climate change stuff, the climate change organization that I'm in has a very rich set of tools and tracking and everything, and it's all built on Force, and so I mean the flexibility and the ability to kind of customize that, I think, is really, really big, and there's a lot of value there where you're getting a lot of underlying data. So it's not like we haven't had any progress in terms of being able to sort of put together components and leverage them, but I think it still is hard for any really complicated product, any complicated program. So I'll give you an example. We looked at a company just a couple of months ago, that what they do is manage shipping for other companies. So they might process 10, 15,000 packages a day, where they're printing the shipping labels, they're managing, tracking what rate do we use for this, and how do we sort of optimize this, where sometimes if you can pack these things into one box, you're going to get a better rate than if you ship it as 3 separate boxes, and so can they. And so that's a company that is generating a lot of money because they're generating a lot of savings for their customers using the big shippers like FedEx and UPS, but it's a very niche product, right? And actually surprisingly complicated code to manage all the different rates and all the different rate plans and all the different kind of rules around tracking and so forth. So I mean, it's hard to imagine that you could just sort of put that together from existing components, because it is kind of a it's a pretty custom, and there's just a lot of applications like that we look at all the time. I mean, we looked at software that runs a car wash, and manages, like, you go to the car wash and say, I want the wax and I want the tires to be cleaned, and it manages controlling the equipment to sort of make sure that you get sprayed with the wax, because you paid for that, and so forth. So it's just, there's so much custom stuff, I think, that that makes it hard. Where I think there is a big opportunity here, and I think we've seen this happening, is the platforms that provide for finding people to do that. So things like Upwork, and the various digital platforms where you can find people and hire them. That I think is really has got some potential. And I think the advantage of it, and I think this is going to be true even, I mean, I think it already was true, but I think it's going to be even more true in the wake of COVID, is that the acceptance of people being remote, of people not, you don't really care where they're working from, is way higher than it was even a year ago. I mean, I think tech was ahead of that, but I think it still is getting more accepted. And so I think that's going to help kind of the gig economy workers around the world, to get these work, because it doesn't really matter now where they're at. So I think that'll be a big change, where I think we're not going to ever see as much. I think people will return to offices, but I think it'll always be less than it was just a couple of years ago, so.
No, I think the difference, Mike, is Upwork, freelancer, Gigster, right? They
Yeah.
are more of a matchmaking platforms, wherein I put a need, they list the people who can do the job, and it is
Right.
up to the person hiring to go through each of the profiles, look at the background of the work, and see. But Upwork doesn't own the work; they just do the matchmaking. It is up to the person. Whereas what I am saying is, it abstracts all that pain for the person, okay, and it gives you the right person because it does all the due diligence.
Right.
Or in your case, shipping product or any product to that matter, you need something to be fixed. It could be a database enhancement, or it could be something. You are not interested in the person because it could be a 1-day job or 2-day job.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
just post the task and that it gets done.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
With somebody, with the right expert, coming from anywhere in the world.
And
So
this is what AiDOOS is planning on.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I think that could be very compelling. And I mean, I think especially if you have people. I mean, one of the things that we say a lot in our diligence when we find companies that are falling short in some area is that you may be a smart team and you'll figure this out, but if you hire somebody who's done this before, they're going to be way more efficient and way more effective at it because
exactly.
they know what mistakes you're going to make, some of the mistakes that they've already made, and they see things that you don't even think about because you haven't done this. So I think there is definitely an opportunity for that, where I think it's like, hey, we've done this, we've solved this problem 5 times, and so we know what kind of the pitfalls are and how to do that, and we may have some stuff that we're able to reuse as well, which is huge. So yeah, no, I think that is interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's any other closing points from the overall.
Yeah, just I
that
think
you want to share?
I mean, yeah, I think as much as I think sometimes we look back on tech and say, wow, it was the golden age at the time of the 80s, or the golden age when Microsoft was just starting on Office. I really feel more than ever that we're at the dawn of a golden age now, where I think it's going to be very, very interesting what happens in the next 10 years as cloud becomes more and more mature, and there just are so many services that you can put together now, to your point, that if you've got knowledge and experience with that, there's just a lot of stuff that you just don't need to reinvent because it's there. So I think it's really a golden age now for folks coming out. And then I think the combination of that with COVID has been so horrible in so many ways and so bad, but one of the golden clouds, or one of the positive things of COVID, is that it has created way more tolerance for this work remotely thing that I think is just going to make people's work lives a lot easier. Less time spent commuting, more time where they can be with families easily, during the day, even, have lunch with their family because, they're not in a separate location. I think take advantage of, I happen to live in a area here in the U.S. where property values are very, very high. But if you can work from anywhere, well, maybe you go move 5 hours east where it's a lot cheaper and you can buy a house and so I think people being able to take advantage of that. So I think we're at the dawn of a new golden age that's going to be very, very interesting. So
that is true. Or maybe people start roaming the world and connect from anywhere.
Yeah, exactly right. Work from anywhere, and I think that is more and
See
more
the world.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, the only thing you have to deal with this, and you're very familiar with this, is you have to deal with the time zones, right? It's like this is not necessarily the time you would have picked for this meeting, but so the time zones can be challenging, but if you're willing to accept that, yeah.
Okay, cool. Just the last closing thing, Mike.
Sure.
As you would have imagined, AiDOOS is not about Dynamics. Dynamics happen to be because I worked personally in Dynamics area, right? But otherwise, as a platform, you name anything. For example, Fortran. Somebody comes to you. I'm just making up, right? We can even bring in a Fortran expert or a COBOL expert. It doesn't matter because that's the nature of the platform. It could be a logistics product. It could be procurement product. It could be SAP, Oracle, Dynamics. Doesn't matter, right? So keep an eye and let us know if you come across any customers who look for problem solving or people. Even we give people on the contractual basis if they need to bump up the capacity. Yeah.
How big are you now? How many? I mean, either in terms of contractors or employees, however you think about it. How big are you?
So I tie up with two kinds of people. One is individual freelancers, and then there are small niche companies. These small niche companies, for example, I have 4 or 5 small dynamics niche companies itself, who have 40, 50 people, dynamics people, right? Similarly, I have Java, .NET, front-end development, mobile development, digital marketing, SAP, Oracle, right? So there are 1,000 to 1,500 people. In fact, not every person in the niche company might have registered, because as long as the company is registered, I take it as people from the company are there. So we are a fairly sized platform. If that was your question, how many people we can scale up if customers ask?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And the only other feedback I'll give you is that, you know, we talked at that time when we were looking for, I think, an SAP person, and and the people you brought in didn't really seem to understand the idea of diligence. Like, they were basically saying, well, we can build that app. And it's like, well, that's not really the question. It's, can you evaluate it? Do you know the best practices? And so we got the sense, and I'm just being totally upfront with
you are right.
you know,
you are
so that
absolutely right.
We got the sense that we were being sold basically a capability rather than I've been there, done that. I know what to look for. And that's, you know, so
correct. No, I was scaling up at that time, my operations. I was bringing in people. I was evaluating. I had to respond within short time. But you are absolutely right. I was not happy either.
Okay, good.
But
well, we're on the same page there.
Yeah, we are on the same page. Rest assured, any skill set you ask for, I will try. Not I will try, I will get.
Okay, great. Well, I'll certainly keep that in mind. And I mean, we are, you know, as I said, we do sometimes get these niche requests where we're not really experts in it, and you know, SAP and Force is and Dynamics, as you mentioned, are those areas where, you know, they really are a different kind of platform. And so the things that you know, we sort of approach that, hey, if it's Java, if it's .NET, if it's Python, if it's, you know, C, you know, we can sort of look at that in a consistent way and use our knowledge and experience to evaluate that. Now, we're not going to necessarily find every little detail that you should be doing differently in Java, you know, but that's not, we can sort of evaluate the code from a scalability, a code quality point of view. But in these other platforms, it really is a difference of kind, you know, and so there really is a whole different set of best practices that you should be following that we're just not familiar with. And so we can't really apply our normal methodology to that. So that's where we really need, you know, some help and expertise. So it's good to know that you're available for that. I appreciate that.
Yep, absolutely.
Cool.
But great discussion.
Hey, thanks a lot for making the time to this.
For the time.
Yeah, and I definitely am interested in what you come out with here. Let me know, and let me know if there's anything, you know, else that I can do to help.
Absolutely. And what I'll do is I'll extract, put in the blog first, give you the link to go through what I have written, and once you think it is good, I'll publish on the forums.
Fantastic. Great. All right.
Thank you, Mike.
Take it easy now.
Take
Thanks
care.
a lot.
Good day.
All right. Stay well. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Take care.